Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about something that happened almost 48 years ago this month. And that is, and I'm sure you're saying, what happened 48 years ago this month? Well, it was April of 1970. And maybe people of a certain age will remember this. And maybe people who have seen the movie will remember it. And maybe some of you will know neither, but it's good to talk about. And that is Apollo 13. Now, Apollo 13 went up on the 11th of April, 1970. Now, I think I want to give a little precursor here so you understand a few things about our Apollo missions. Now, our space program goes back to the beginning of the 1960s, and we started with the Apollo program in 1967. The problem was that there were a lot of setbacks. There was a terrible, terrible fire on the launch pad, and 3 astronauts were killed. That set everything back a little bit, but by 1968, they were ready to start again. And the Apollo mission started, and the Apollo missions were very successful. And we finally worked our way to Apollo 11, which landed on the moon. Now, in this day and age, I don't think anybody understands how amazing, how exciting, how absolutely blown away everyone was by that very fact. And the Apollo programs continued. We went to the moon again with Apollo 12. Not as big a bang because, well, we had done it already. And then we got for Apollo 13, and the jokes were everywhere. I remember in school everybody saying Apollo 13, and everybody said it's going to be unlucky. And even in the news, people had talked about stuff like that, and they said that's just such stupid superstition, etc. Well, nonetheless, those were the jokes going around. And it wasn't helped by when they took off, which was about 13 minutes after 1 in the afternoon on April the 11th, which translates into 1313. Now, I'm not trying to turn this into anything about superstition causing a problem. But it took off, and everybody was happy, and everybody kind of said, that was fun, And we went to the regular mode of watching our space program. We would watch like Walter Cronkite or whomever was on the news, and they would sit there and give us updates. And we were hungry for news dealing with space because it was a big thing. It was all part of the Cold War at the time. And about 2 days into the mission, there was an announcement that broke into the television stating that there has been a mishap with Apollo 13, that they may have to cancel the mission. That's as much information as we knew. In fact, the mission and what was going on was pretty much not known to us. We knew there were problems, but they didn't go into any details. Now, what turned out as time went on, they kind of got into more detail in telling us stuff, and well, we knew that they were trying to work their way home. And you know something? When I was in school that day, the day they returned, and it was a long time before they landed, everybody was betting and saying, will they make it, will they not? Nobody really knew. Even the news was sitting there stating the fact that the shield, the heat shield, may have been damaged in the explosion. You see, there was a massive explosion in the tanks, in the service module, and it blew up, and they lost oxygen, they lost everything. It was an absolute disaster. And the fact that they actually survived this is nothing short of incredible. I must say that watching it while it happened, everybody was kind of terrified and kind of sitting there saying, they almost have a snowball's chance in hell of making it. But the thing is, as we sat in class, and the entire day we watched television, they rolled in a big black and white television. That was all we had in the schools. There was no such thing as color. We watched black and white. And a big black and white television, like 19 inches, which was big. And we watched everything live. And my teacher, who was a different age, you have to remember, said the class should pray for the astronauts. And we did. I don't think they would do something like that today. And we watched and watched. And then they announced that they were coming in. And of course, there would be no information coming from the space capsule for the entire time of re-entry until they entered the proper atmosphere. So it was a long, long wait. And I think in that class, that day, you could hear a pin drop. Everybody was just watching. And then we heard the voice, I believe of Jim Lovell, I'm not sure which astronaut. And they had made it, and they landed. And it was an emotional moment. My teacher was a wreck. And I think everybody in the class started cheering and applauding. This was a big, big moment, and it was a fantastic combination of technology, ingenuity, and damn luck. Because when they re-entered, they had to do everything manually, practically. And had they been off a little bit, they would have been cooked, because the heat shield would not have protected them. But it did. And that's one of the greatest moments, if you think about it. There's an old saying, you never learn from your successes. You learn from your failures. And a fantastic lesson was learned by NASA on a lot of things with Apollo 13. In many respects, it's perhaps the greatest success story in the history of the American space program. And it's right next to landing on the moon. And you know something? Those guys were going to land on the moon and they lost it. That's something that they had trained for their careers. And they weren't going to do it. And even watching interviews of these guys 40 years later, they still feel the remorse of not being on the moon. There's only a handful of individuals who have actually walked on the moon. I was very lucky. I got to interview one of the individuals who walked on the moon. I interviewed Buzz Aldrin. And it was fascinating, the things he told me in our conversation, which I'll talk about another time, perhaps. So I thought this would be an interesting thing to mention, since it is April of the year 2018. And this year marks the 48th anniversary of Apollo 13. The movie came out. The movie's a lot more dramatic than what happened, I got to tell you, on the spacecraft themselves, they never argued. In mission control, they never argued. They are very calm. If you argue, you lose control. And the most fascinating thing, there's that scene in Apollo 13 in which they take a pile of stuff in front of this whole group of individuals and say, we got to make a square peg fit into a round hole. And this whole gang goes to work. You want to know the true story? It was one man alone who came up with that, not a whole group of individuals. And that is the fella that saved the mission. So, next time you watch the movie and you see some of the stuff, it's very factual. But there are parts where they add to the drama because it's hard to believe that one man could come up with that whole thing. And it's hard to believe that these astronauts in Apollo 13, under amazing stress, were able to keep their control. And lastly, mission control. They kept calm. They kept their heads. And because everyone kept their heads and they thought and they were innovative and they were creative, they were able to bring 3 astronauts on a totally damaged ship that for all intents and purposes was going to be their tomb, and brought them back. Pretty incredible. Thank you.